But our topic tonight is U.S. policy on the global environment, an environmental activist's perspective. And our guest, as you know, is Mr. Peter Berle, who is the president of the National Audubon Society. You probably noticed on a front-page article in The Sun the other day, they listed Mr. Berle, along with other heads of environmental organization, as being favorably disposed toward NAFTA and being present with the president at his announcement of his satisfaction with the environmental aspects of NAFTA. The Audubon Society, which Mr. Berle heads, does play a progressive role with respect to environmental activism. It's involved, as you know, in many projects overseas with respect to the wildlife habitat, and is considered to be a leader with respect to issues of climate change, the global environment, and sustaining development. Mr. Berle, our guest, has not only chaired that organization since 1985, but has been active in environmental causes of various kinds for over 2 decades. He presently chairs a special commission on the Adirondacks for the 21st century. He's on Governor Cuomo's Environmental Advisory Board. He has served on the National Commission on the Superfund. He's been on the board, I think still is, of the 20th Century Fund. He's been on various advisory groups to the Environmental Protection Agency, and recently has served on a commission which has done a major study of environmental matters in the world. His environmental concerns include work in his first law position in the 1960s on scenic Hudson, which was when the Con Edison Company was kept from building a major facility on Storm Mountain in the Hudson River Valley. He's been active in various capacity with respect to the Adirondacks and that enormous system of state park for a number of years. From 76 to 79, he was head of New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation, and it was during that time when the Love Canal business was discovered and dealt with. So his interests at present are strongly do deal with the international environment. His practical experience of the past 20 years provide with a substantial background. Very quickly, a framework of Mr. Berle's career. He's a Harvard graduate, undergraduate, served in the United States Air Force for a number of years after that, was an intelligence officer in the Philippines as well as a paratrooper, law degree from Harvard, entered the practice of law in '64, was elected to the state legislature in New York in '68, served there till '74, was commended by Rutgers University as the outstanding member of that body in 1971. He wrote a book on this experience and his views in 1974. And then, as I say, worked actively with the state as well as in law practice dealing with environmental matters, and joined the Audubon Society in 1985. I've had a tremendous, I enjoyed very much reading Mr. Berle's resume. He made me promise not to, in fact, read it all, but it's very interesting. It begins by saying that he's a lawyer, an outdoorsman, a farmer, and longtime environmental activist. And it concludes by noting that he's a competitive cross-country skier, a runner, canoeist, hiker, and fly fisherman. And then lives in Manhattan, has a home in the Berkshires in Massachusetts, and then very quickly says that he has 4 children as well. I must admit, I really enjoyed it, the whole resume. Mr. Berle is sort of in the Theodore Roosevelt mode. Great deal of physical activity, intellectual interests, and a dedication to public policy. I enjoy it, especially since I first met Peter when we were both young Air Force officers over 3 decades ago in the Philippines, And that was very much his character then. Not mentioned here are a number of things. There was a place called 100 Islands in Lingayen Gulf, made up of coral rocks. And one of them was large enough to have a small beach, and a fisherman would take you out there and you could spend time there. And I don't know if Peter remembers it, but I do vividly, because you could see the fishing boats in the distance at night, and I have this image of shark-infested waters. And Peter would swim from one coral rock to the other. Alone, I should underline.
Shark take the rest.
Yeah, and during the day, in that clear water, you could look down and see the barracuda. And when Peter would become uncomfortable with the heat of the day, he would take his dip. Again, he was unaccompanied by others. What I'm saying is that indeed he has, as far as I can remember, always had a deep affection for nature and a very vigorous spirit. And he follows very much in his father's footsteps as well, I should notice. All of you have, in your American history books, come to grips with the name of Adolph Berle, one of Franklin Roosevelt's brain trusts. And Peter's father precedes him, of course, with a strong interest in public affairs. So I'm absolutely delighted that we have an environmentalist who is certainly authentic, thoughtful, and committed to public policy, and deeply experienced in the matter about which he's about to speak. It's my enormous pleasure to give you Mr. Peter Berle.
Well, I enjoy being here, and let me tell you, there is nothing more that creates greater apprehension than to be introduced by a friend of yours that you have not seen for 33 years and with whom you enjoyed experiences when you were in a different role in life. So, Frank, that was very benign and kind. The thing he did not mention that had to do with pitting oneself against nature was that on this beach that we used to sleep, which was a very narrow beach behind a very small coral rock, which wasn't much bigger than this room, one would sleep on a tarp in the evening, and the tide would come up. And you would wake up at about 2 o'clock in the morning with the tide, your head against the rock, and the tide right at your feet. And since the rock was pretty jagged and rough, there was always a question as to whether you were about to get wiped out by the sea. And for one reason or another, we all survived that. It was a great experience. I wanted to talk a little bit about where it looks as though U.S. policy might be going, and more specifically about the opportunities that we have and where we could be going as we look at the U.S. and its approach to the global environment. Needless to say, we're a major player. While Mr. Bush never recognized that we had an opportunity to set the stage in Rio last summer, I was fortunate to lead the Audubon delegation there. The U.S. was expected to be able to help shape and frame the debate, and we didn't. Whether we can regain the kind of initiative that people expected us to take and have the kind of impact that we ought to be able to have is, I think, one of the great questions that faces this administration, particularly an administration which has got a whole host of issues on the plate. Let me also say in beginning that the whole question of where you come out and how the environment is protected is one in which obviously compromise and push and pull is a piece of the process. But the thing that is different in the political context today from what it was, I think, a decade ago is that everybody's an environmentalist. Everybody's for it. With that in mind, it's hard to understand why there is so much debate. But I thought that perhaps some view of it is best shed by a quote that Mo Udall has in his book, Too Funny to Be President, in which he thinks about the views of compromise and how people approached compromise within a different context. And this was during the time when this country was struggling with the question of prohibition. And Mo talks about a judge in Mississippi. Remember that judges were basically county executives at that point, who was challenged to state his views about whiskey at a time when it was both controversial and which compromise was not regarded as a useful attribute. And the judge said the following: "My friends, I had not intended to discuss this controversial subject with you at this time. However, I want you to know that I do not shun controversy. On the contrary, I will take a stand on any issue at any time, regardless of how fraught with controversy it might be. You have asked me how I feel about whiskey. Well, here's how I feel about whiskey. If, when you say whiskey, you mean the devil's brew, the poison scourge, the bloody monster that defiles innocence, dethrones reason, destroys the home, creates misery and poverty, yea, literally takes the bread from the mouths of little children, if you mean the evil drink that topples the Christian man and woman from the pinnacle of righteousness, gracious living into the bottomless pit of degradation and despair, shame, helplessness, and hopelessness, then certainly I'm against it. But if, when you say whiskey, you mean the oil of conversation, the philosophic wine, the ale that is consumed when good fellows get together, that puts the song in their hearts and laughter in their lips, the warm glow of contentment in their eyes, if you mean Christmas cheer, if you mean the stimulating drink that puts the spring into the old gentleman's step on a foggy, crispy morn, if you mean the drink which enables a man to magnify his joy and his happiness and to forget, if only for a little while, life's great tragedies and heartaches and sorrows, and if you mean the drink, the sale of which puts into our treasuries untold millions of dollars, which are then used to provide tender care for our little crippled children, our blind, our deaf, our dumb, our pitiful, the aged and infirm, to build highways, hospitals, and schools, then certainly I am for it. This is my stand, and I will not compromise." So much for Judge Sweat, but hearing people talk about the environment, I have the sense that a lot of that dialogue continues in recent political debate. I wanted to talk about three disconnected issues, which hopefully I can say enough that is either outrageous enough or confrontational enough that it might stir some questions in the latter part of our hour together. I wanted to talk about three basic issues that, in my judgment, will define the kind of globe that we will leave for those that follow us, and more importantly, which the U.S. must deal with if we are going to achieve what I think most people consider an imperative, and that is sustainability. This is a word which, as we learned in Rio, means something different to everybody that utters it, but for the purpose of this debate, let me argue that sustainability is the ability to meet the needs of this generation without impacting on the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And let me also suggest that when we're talking about needs, we're not only talking about food and fiber, but we're talking about quality of life and, of course, the great spiritual values which nature has encouraged in the human soul since the beginning of time. Again, if that ought to be our objective, achieving sustainability on a global basis, and if that is the case, then a couple of big issues have to be dealt with very quickly. One relates to population, the other relates to climate change, and of course trade is a piece of all of this, and since the whole question of NAFTA is now high on everybody's agenda, I thought I'd spend a few minutes about an approach to NAFTA, which I'm sure will generate a good deal of controversy if nothing else does. Let me suggest that the imperative to deal with population is one that we tend to not look at seriously enough. One of the problems with environmentalists is they're always talking about the fact that the sky is falling in and there's nothing to be done about it, and we're supposed to have this great feeling of guilt and obviously contribute to the National Audubon Society once you've got that feeling well and stirred in your mind. But the population issue is a tough one for us all to grasp. To put it in a broader context, I am in the springtime of my senility at the age of 55, and world population has doubled in my lifetime. It's now at 5.5 billion. It was half that when I was born in 1937. It is scheduled under existing projections to double again somewhere in this side of the middle of the next century. So if you think of any environmental issue that is complicated based on human impact on resource base and on everything else, it gets twice as bad in the next generation than it is in ours. We tend frequently to think about this as somebody else's problem. It's Bangladesh, it's Pakistan, or whatever. And as you get fully comfortable with that framework, next time you're calling your relative or friend or uncle in Los Angeles, ask that person how they enjoyed their commute that morning. We have the capacity to choke ourselves as others do. Let me suggest that there are three basic pieces of this problem which we have now come to recognize. When I started with Audubon, running this institution 7 or 8 years ago, we saw it as fairly simple. The basic thinking as late as really the last couple of years has been it's an issue of fertility. Somehow if we can meet unmet demand for birth control and we can see that clinics and resources are available, that is going to get a big handle on the problem. And there's no question that fertility is a major issue. But we have since come to learn, and others have told us for a long time, but it's now part of the conventional wisdom, that that's only a very small piece of it. Clearly, people who have been talking about women's issues for years have pointed out that in places where female literacy is higher, birth rates go down. Where educational opportunities, economic opportunities, and so on for women are greater, fertility is less. You're not going to do it only with condoms and pills. It has to do with the way society is organized, and this whole question of dealing with health care and women's issues is now very much part of the population agenda, and indeed is creating some very interesting debates. One of the things that happened at Rio last summer was there was one group led by Berle, who argued that let's get the environmentalists out of this crowd because when they start talking about population issues, they are tending to diminish the importance of women's issues. There were other people that said you got to put them together, and that's a debate that's going to go on and on. But in terms of dealing with a global population issue, and we're going to get to U.S. policy in a moment, we've got to deal with that. We've also learned, and again this came out of Rio and it was very clear, that you really can't think in terms of resources and population without thinking about consumption. It was very clear from people in Rio, from underdeveloped countries, saying, listen, if you're worried about global impact on the environment, and then you start looking at numbers, when one American consumes 20 to 50 times, and name the resource, that somebody in Pakistan or Bangladesh does, if you're really worried about environmental impact, you from the affluent part of the globe have got to start consuming less while you're telling us that we've got to reduce our numbers because it's hypocritical of you to be talking numbers when in fact you're just using everything up, particularly when, as they say, you are coming to our countries and stripping, and this is totally oversimplified and I understand that, but they argue you're stripping our resources to defend your consumption levels, and then you're telling us that we are screwing things up by reproducing too rapidly. So the consumption issue has got to be a piece of it. And then the tough issue, and this is particularly tough, is the whole question of migration. And I say migration rather than immigration because one of the things that I find disturbing in what's going on in this country today is that it's not only is there questions about illegal immigration, which have a whole host of ramifications, but it also, that debate is loosening some of the uglier pieces of our political spectrum. Those who call it racism, call it what have you. I mean, there's a really ugly element in the immigration debate, which is separate and apart from those people in good faith who say we've got to deal with this issue. But it gets very complicated, particularly from an environmentalist perspective in this country. Let me suggest that at the moment the U.S. has no population policy. Let me also suggest that in November of 1994, there will be a rerun of Rio in Cairo. The difference, however, is that the Cairo UN conference is based on population and development as opposed to the environment and development. And so part of our charge must be to come to that conference with some clearly stated views about where we are. And that's difficult because we don't do this very well, particularly on this issue, which is so sensitive and so difficult. Let me suggest that this administration has made a major step ahead when they repealed the Mexico City policy, which they did by executive order. The Mexico City policy was the policy promulgated by President Reagan when he said, we will not make dollars available to family planning enterprises that also are engaged in abortion or counsel on abortion, even though our dollars are not supportive of the abortion part of their effort. As long as they do it, there are no U.S. dollars involved. And that kept the U.S. out of a whole host of activities with Planned Parenthood and others. It kept us out of the UNFPA and a lot of international groups that were struggling with this issue. Clinton reversed that, in my judgment, major step ahead. However, let me also suggest that we need to be much more articulate, and I would suggest that as a matter of public policy, we ought to be announcing to the world that we want to lead a consortium of the developed nations to provide family planning services to meet all unmet demand. Now, the advantage of that is that doesn't get into the business of whether you're coercing people, that doesn't get into the business of whether you're violating their religious views, but I think there is no debate on anybody's part that there's a lot of unmet demand out there, and it ought to be met. That's going to take technology, it's going to take money, it's going to take the delivery of services. We ought to be articulating that as one of the goals of U.S. foreign policy as a means of providing the sustainability that the globe is going to require so that when we pass it on, it'll be functional. Let me suggest that we also have to deal with a consumption issue by starting at home. A lot of people say, well, you crazy environmentalists are going to change our way of life. We've got to put on the hair shirt and give up all these good things. The fact is that we waste so much now that simply doing what we do now at our current level of consumption efficiently will produce enormous gains. Some of you may have seen what Audubon did when we took a 100-year-old building in New York and gutted it and started over again and built a structure on a cost-effective basis, which means that any extra money we spent beyond a normal renovation we're going to get back in less than 5 years through savings. We're using less than half the energy than would be required if we had built the building according to code. And we did that simply using the existing technology and better ways of putting this stuff together. We have the opportunity to achieve tremendous savings in the way we do things by applying the technology that's out there and having the sense that if you do it, it pays. That involves, if we do it right, not only a tremendous use of less resources, tremendous savings, obviously tremendous benefit for the environment, and curiously enough, also has something to do with, and I'm going to get back into this in climate change, if we become more energy efficient, not only does it help the environment, but it also helps the U.S. economy because we use more BTUs per dollar of GNP than our major trading partners. We use something like twice the BTUs per dollar of GNP than our Japanese and European rivals. If that's the case when energy prices start to fluctuate, who gets hit the hardest the soonest in terms of a world competitive position? It's us. We can fix that. The technology's out there, and it has to do with this whole notion of how we consume much more efficiently. Finally, let me suggest that with respect to migration, again, we have got to do the kinds of things, assist the kinds of forces in the world that makes it more attractive for people to stay where they are rather than move in large numbers across frontiers, because when that begins to happen, the kind of destabilization, the kind of resource use, the kind of misery that that achieves is not one that anybody's been able to cope with. I don't know what the answer is as it relates to dealing with that issue, but we need to start the national debate to figure it out. And I would suggest that this country has got to go through some process between now and November of 1994 to formulate a policy toward population which we can articulate to the rest of the world and show up at Cairo and expect to be able to lead. That needs to get put in place. The administration obviously is preoccupied with a lot of things at this point. I have made this case vigorously to my friend Tim Wirth, who, as you know, is now counselor at the State Department, and I think it's probably going to fall on his shoulders to get it going. And it represents, I think, a tremendous challenge as well as a great opportunity for the U.S. Let me say a little bit about climate change. Again, what are the big global issues that have got to be dealt with, and what should the U.S. policy be as it relates to it? we are having a lot of fun talking about whether it does or doesn't happen and whether the computer model of this person or that person is crazy and whether this is all, again, some hoax that is the crisis of the day and that will then be supplanted by some future one in a few years. And that's robust and it's healthy and it gets people op-ed space in the Washington Post and the New York Times and so on. Let me suggest that there are some numbers that are not in dispute. One number is that the CO2 levels and the greenhouse gas levels in our atmosphere now are a great deal higher than they were 100 years ago, and even higher if you look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, tremendous magnification of greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere. Let me also suggest that the science is undisputed that these gases trap warmth. Energy comes down from the sun, it's absorbed by the Earth spits it back out again, and it gets stuck. And that produces, at least from a theoretical standpoint, global warming. And there's no doubt about the physics that occurs. Then the question is, well, is it really happening? And if it doesn't happen, why are we worried about it? What degree of certainty do we need to engage in a policy shift that has an impact on this? It's kind of interesting to look at what happens if you say the projections are correct. The Science Advisory Committee to the UN, which has worked hard at this, both in 90 and 92, said given a doubling in greenhouse gases by, again, the early part of the next century at current levels of consumption, we're looking at a temperature rise average throughout the globe of about 3 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. And that might well seem like not a great deal, but the change from the Ice Age to now was somewhere between 5 and 9 degrees. So we're looking at a level which could put us in about the degree of change that was the difference between the Ice Age and today. What difference does that make? If you're in some areas, it gets a little wetter. That's okay. If you're in some areas like the heartland of the United States, it gets a lot drier. So from our perspective, if the projections are correct, obviously a strong national asset, our agricultural production, has a substantial impact. And you can say maybe this will work, but if you come from Vanuatu, which is, as you know, is the New Hebrides, it was pointed out by their representative at the UN last year that a 2-foot sea level rise, which is occasioned by a 4.5 degree increase in global temperature, 4.5 being well within everybody's predicted range, that jacks up sea level by 2 feet, and Vanuatu disappears, as well as a lot of other places, including, probably doesn't disappear, but I would suggest that your great waterfront out here is going to look a lot different if the sea is higher. Why does sea level rise? We're not even talking now about melting of the global ice cap, or the polar ice caps. We're talking simply about the expansion of salt water that occurs as it gets warmer. So the stakes are reasonably high for major disruptions if the trend continues. From an environmentalist point of view, the kinds of changes that occur in natural systems under natural climate changes, the migration of wildlife, the adaptation of species, the diversity of biological things out there, it happens too fast under this scenario to be able to adjust. So you lose a lot of biological diversity and you lose a lot of assets from a global standpoint. To me, the interesting thing is that doing something about it is worth doing, even if the projections of global warming don't come about. Because the real place to start, again, has to do with energy use. It has to do with what we dump into the atmosphere. And again, from the U.S. perspective, it involves making our economy more efficient, making it more competitive, using the kind of technology that we are developing and that others don't have to be able to market that elsewhere. So that, at least from my perspective, it's a no-lose proposition. And I think, again, this president has made a step ahead when he said we are going to try to stabilize CO2 emissions by the year 2000 at 1990 levels. That was the formula that all of us pushed Bush to adopt when he went to Rio, and the formula that the Europeans have adopted, which the U.S. steadfastly refused to do, pushed hard by the coal lobby, as you might have assumed. Coal itself is an interesting issue because the big deposits of coal around the globe are not only in the U.S. but in China and in the USSR, no longer the USSR, in Russia. And obviously, as those economies grow, the first place that's logical for them to look to energy other than the Russian oil reserves is also coal. So we have a real stake in seeing that technology is developed by which they can use that stuff or use something other than that that doesn't have the same kind of impact. And I would suggest that part of our global policy with respect to the climate has got to be first to actually implement the pledge that the President has made, which is not going to be easy. Not because it's not doable, but we've got a lot of entrenched forces who see capital expenditure and other difficulties in a time of economic stress and things they don't want to undertake. But we ought to be doing that, and again, we ought to be leading in the world in terms of achieving these kinds of approaches and greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere. To date, in the preparations for Rio, the real leaders on this were the Germans, pushed hard by the Dutch and some others, so that there again we lost a lot of the initiative. And it was fascinating to watch the Japanese at Rio, because the Japanese were strong for this. And the reason that they were strong, well, I postulate that the reasons that they were strong for this was that the Japanese were also very active in the effort to set up the financing mechanisms by which developing countries and others would be purchasing technology. To me, what was happening was the Japanese were saying, we are the masters and going to be the marketers of the technology that's going to deal with some of these issues. We are going to help set up the UN process for financing so that indeed we can get a handle on this market. And we're going to come out ahead all the way around, particularly since we're so energy efficient now, that the kinds of changes in energy use that other people will have to be making, we've already made. So that they were winning on every score, or thought they were. And again, it was disappointing to me as an American citizen to watch our delegation basically sitting there on their hands while this was going by and saying, we think this is a bad idea. So we have an opportunity to get out in front there. And we also have, I think, to recognize that a lot of other people are going to be moving in that direction. And if we are not there, we lose. Let me again spend a minute or two on NAFTA, and then my understanding is that your format calls for questions, and I hope I can provoke some controversy. NAFTA, from an environmental perspective, has been a very tough one. This is an issue in which the environmental community is beginning to choose up sides. I was talking to Bruce Babbitt 2 days ago, and he observed that one of the interesting things about the NAFTA fight is that aside from labor, which is united and in an opposition, practically every other constituency group that makes its views known in Washington, whether it be the environmental folk, whether it be the manufacturers, or whether it be the retailers, you name them, they are all divided. They have not been able to hang together because people are looking at this issue from different perspectives, and there isn't, outside of labor, a unified viewpoint with respect to any of the traditional constituency groups, which is going to make a really interesting mix. And indeed, in this administration, you've got the president hard on one side, and you've got the number 3 man in the House of Representatives staking out his position on the other. So, and with respect to the kind of political scene and the sport of watching politics, this one is going to be quite a show. The reason that we're backing NAFTA, and it's certainly, since I run an institution that's got almost 600,000 members and 510 chapters, if there's any unanimity in Audubon on this issue, I haven't found it yet. But the preponderance of us, and I feel very strongly that from an environmentalist perspective, the environment is better served with NAFTA than without it. That's kind of the bottom line for us. Why is that? One reason is that the status quo is simply awful. How many of you here have spent any time on the Rio Grande? Has anybody spent any time down there? I spent a week and a half on the Rio Grande in Texas in January. And I had the opportunity to meet with plant managers, environmentalists, public health folk, state officials, federal officials. And if you want to see an environmental disaster, which is worse than anything that Frank and I saw in Southeast Asia in 1960, go to Matamoros in Mexico. Matamoros is directly across the river from Brownsville, Texas. You stand in Matamoros and you are closer to Brownsville than I am to the stadium out there. So in effect, they are single cities with the mighty Rio Grande, which has been reduced to this muddy little channel in between them. You're looking at a city that has 500,000 people in it without a single closed sewer in the city. A lot of the city has no sewers at all because for miles the colonias, which are the settlements, have no sewage at all, no electricity, and running water, a few pipes here and there, but most people carrying buckets to other places. This settlement grew up around the maquiladora plants. The maquiladora plants are plants that were built under the maquiladora program, under which we and the Mexicans agreed that if the U.S. company built a plant within X number of miles of the border, they could import raw materials without duty and then pay a very low value-added tax going back. And they could get the benefit of cheap labor to do that. And so that there was a substantial number of plants that were built along the border. And basically, from the plant manager's point of view, when you talk to a maquiladora plant manager today, he says, NAFTA doesn't bother us one way or the other because we have free trade. We have the benefit of it now. We can bring stuff back and forth. The only thing we can't do is ship our goods into Mexico, but they're producing for the U.S. market. And as a result of that, you have this huge influx of folk with absolutely no infrastructure. And you've got pretty spotty compliance with environmental laws. Mexican environmental laws on the books are pretty good. In some areas, they're tougher than ours. There has been practically no enforcement, so that they sit on the books, but they're not enforced. And the maquiladora record has been mixed. There are some U.S. enterprises that have been very responsible and done it right and done the same sorts of things that they have done in the U.S. And there's some in which it has been terrible, in which they have dumped a lot of stuff and poisoned a lot of workers and so on. So there's a whole spectrum of activity out there. And the people who are afraid of NAFTA on the borders say, if this is what trade produces, we want none of it. And you certainly can't argue with that when you see it. The fact is that if you don't do something about this, it just keeps right on going. And so the need is, one, to do something about that and then build the infrastructure that enables you to have some basic sewage treatment, to have basic sanitation services, to be able to police the industries. And this is a problem not only in Matamoros, but as you keep on going up the river, whether it be Nuevo Laredo or whether it be Juarez or what have you. There is one sort of piece of democratic justice to all of this, and that is that most of what comes out of these communities winds up in the Rio Grande on both sides, more from the Mexican side than on the U.S. side, because we've done a better job in terms of sewage treatment plants. But it's pretty foul stuff, and it all runs into the Rio Grande. Now, the democratic piece of all of this is that the sole source of drinking water in the border is the Rio Grande. So everybody drinks it. And it's not a happy sight. I went to some of the water purification plants, and people are surviving it, but if you saw what was in the river, you would be buying bottled water if you could. So we have a major problem there. And again, my colleagues in the environmental community that say, boy, this is NAFTA, and if it does this, we don't want it. Our response to them is we've got to deal with that issue. And I was part of the negotiating team from the environmental community with a U.S. trade representative on the side agreements. And we think in the side agreements is the structure to provide the financing and the mechanisms to do something about the infrastructure needs on the border. And we're looking at a program, we're looking at a problem that's somewhere between $6 and $8 billion to deal with the difficulties on those border cities. And right now, there is no mechanism and no process to move on that issue. And the current framework that's been set up under the side agreements and the commitments that have been made relate to a bond financing agency and some various kinds of public and private funding to get this thing going. My fear is that without a NAFTA, that doesn't happen, and we're back to another decade of negotiations and what have you. The other piece that is, again, critical from my perspective is that lax enforcement of environmental laws under NAFTA is now recognized as a trade problem. In shorthand, what that means is that if you are producing something and you are not meeting environmental standards because you're not complying with the law, and therefore getting a trade advantage because you can sell stuff for less under what's been worked out under the NAFTA process, the people on the other side of the fence can complain about that. And indeed, ultimately, you can get trade sanctions applied as a result of failure to enforce. Now, that has never happened before in trade. And it's a cranky and somewhat cumbersome process that's been worked out through NAFTA, which goes on through these the Environmental Commission and Secretariat that's a part of that. But that is an element that must be part of trade in the future. It's going to be a question in the GATT negotiations, which are next. And again, my perspective is that if we don't get it going in NAFTA, we're never going to be able to do it anywhere else. And throughout the globe, the question of environmental enforcement as part of a trade process has got to be linked. And I suggest that we have achieved that with some imperfections, but at least we're farther down the road than we have ever been before. There are some other issues. Some of my colleagues say this thing's going to destroy U.S. environmental laws. We don't think so. Some say that this is going to override a lot of the wildlife treaties. The way that works is that if there's a conflict between a restriction on taking of wildlife, and that is argued to be a restraint of trade, then you can override the restriction, which was the famous case on dolphin tuna. We think we've got that one fixed in this one. The reason why I say we think is that there's always some tribunal that might be able to interpret it differently, but we're pretty confident about that. So most of the challenges that have been made from an environmental perspective, I think are pretty well done in this one. It's not perfect, but again, the bottom line from our perspective is that we're better off with it than without it. Talk about controversy. This is hotly contested, and you're going to hear a lot of arguments on both sides of that. The other thing that I think is worth commenting on is the great unknowns on the public health side. And I think it's hard to tell whether NAFTA helps this or not, but I simply want to leave it with you because, again, it is a question with respect to U.S. foreign policy that we really haven't thought a lot about before. There's a young pediatrician in Brownsville who is involved, Dr. Rocco, in the local clinic there that basically deals with low-income families who come to this clinic for public health help. She started noticing a few years ago a tremendous number of incidents, tremendous in terms of a national standard, of anencephaly, infants born either without brains or partially formed brains, which is a statistical number she'd seen in the textbooks, but never really had seen one because if you look at the nation as a whole, I forget what the numbers are, but they're very low. And suddenly she began to see quite a number of these cases. She kept a chart on her wall, and one of the interesting things is that in Brownsville there didn't seem to be any particular pattern, but she was looking at numbers that were just way off the national averages by a factor of 10 or more. She still doesn't know, and classically she had all the problems that people in public health have when they run into a problem. First thing that happened was that the medical establishment said, because she wrote an article about it, you're doing undocumented research, and therefore we can't believe it. She said, I'm not doing research, I'm just telling you what I'm seeing out there. The mayor of Brownsville jumped all over because she said, you're saying bad things about our city and you can't do that. But the fact is that she's made these observations, and that tells most people that there is something horrendous that's going on from an environmental perspective. We don't know what it is. It hits at the most vulnerable part of the human system, the kinds of things that happen during pregnancy when the embryo is the most vulnerable. And the one consensus is that this has something to do with what's going on from an environmental perspective, both in Brownsville or in Mexico or both. And again, from the point of view of our national interest, we've got to deal with these kinds of issues, and the place that I would argue that you've got to start is by better enforcement of the environmental laws on the books. And to do that, we have learned in the United States that you can't simply rely on a governmental enforcement mechanism. As Frank mentioned, I spent most of my career as an environmental lawyer, and it's great to talk about being a lawyer because our profession is not the most popular in this country at this point. Everybody's down on lawyers until they get a notice from, until they get arrested in the middle of the night or they have problems with the IRS or what have you. But the fact is that one of the things that the genius of our system has brought to the world with all of the problems of over-litigation is the notion of the citizen attorney general. The private group, the private citizen that can go into the court and say to a governmental agency, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, and if a court finds that so, it orders the government to behave. We take that for granted, but when I started practicing law in 1964, standing for citizens to sue was very complicated, much more difficult than it is today. Now it's verified in statute in most cases. When you talk to people from Spanish lands, the idea of a citizen suing the state is just not within part of their Weltanschauung. They just don't think that that's the way you do things. What I'm suggesting is that the whole citizen enforcement piece we have learned is an important part of making the process go. And again, while it's not as tight as we would like to see it, again, through the commissions that are set up by NAFTA, we fought for and acquired the opportunity and the standing for citizen and groups, whether it be an Audubon Society in the U.S. or a similar enterprise, Pro Natura or what have you in Mexico, to be able to have standing to come in to the tribunal and talk about this question of enforcement of environmental laws. So again, my judgment, and I defer to others on the economics of NAFTA, from an environmental point of view, we win. Not as much as we'd like, not as tight as we'd like, but we're moving away from a status quo which is, in my judgment, intolerable. My guess is that the kind of debate about these issues, which we presumably are having and will have as you tell me I'm wrong, is not one that will characterize the debate that's going to go on the Hill. I am fascinated by the fact that everybody that's getting up there and making pronouncements is doing it based on not having seen the text. The side agreements still aren't fully available, but that seems to be being tied down by the facts and the language has never been sort of the major piece of the American political debate. And one of the things that you need to do is to see that among your colleagues, maybe some look at the issues, and as I say, they're not simple, goes on, because I suspect that as the rhetoric accelerates, what's actually in the agreements and what the current conditions are is going to look worse and worse. Let me suggest that there is one other piece of this debate that you might want to look at, again, that has to do with where the U.S. and where our policy is. I don't know if many of you saw the New York Times article that was the front page right-hand column last Sunday. But what the author of that article did was he looked at the side agreements with respect to labor and the side agreements with respect to the environment. And his basic thesis was that the environmental side agreements have teeth and have substance, whereas the labor ones have far less. He also speculated as to why that was so, and you can make your own judgments about that. One of the points that he made, which I think was so, was that those of us who run major national environmental groups always said to the administration, if you get enough, we'll back you. We may not be able to bring all of our troops with us, but we'll back you. The labor people never said that, and it was pretty clear that for their own internal reasons they were not able to say that, so that at least as far as Bradshaw, who wrote the article, was concerned, he said, well, that had something to do with how hard the administration was prepared to fight on the labor side agreements, because they could spill a lot of blood, but if it didn't get them any support, the political equation wasn't there. That was speculation on his part, but I think there may be something to it. The other thing that he said was that if you look at the whole problem of suing to enforce local laws, the Mexicans and the U.S. were prepared to take some chances on that that they were not prepared to with respect to labor. And that had to do with, from his perspective, something to do with the political context that labor functions in Mexico and so on. So the conditions were different. Again, I'm hardly expert on the labor situation, but what I would suggest to you that as a point of view of American foreign policy, we have an opportunity to lead in the environmental arena, which we ought to be seizing. And the thing that we can do to do that is to make sure that our administration understands that that's expected of them. And one of the great things I find about running a citizen organization is that with all of the problems of American democracy, we really can make a difference. If you raise enough hell, somebody pays attention to you, and maybe something happens. I would argue that, while I know that your institution doesn't take stands, as individuals, all of you ought to be talking about and expressing concern to not only elected representatives, but people who write articles and so on, about the opportunity and the real necessity of the U.S. taking a global perspective in terms of our own foreign policy that takes us farther down the road towards sustainability, because the alternatives don't look so hot. Having said that, I hope I provoked some concern or disagreement, and we can then discuss it. Thank you. The question is whether there's stockholder activity with respect to U.S. plants that are in the maquiladora program, and particularly those that are more recalcitrant about environmental standards. The answer is yes. There have been a number of groups. I've also been part of the leadership on the development of the series principles, which are not designed specifically at the Rio Grande, but were a series of principles relating to environmental responsibility that might be a guide for pension funds and investors generally. While only a limited number of companies have signed up for those, it's fascinating that how the industry groups are doing their best to form principles that are similar but perhaps don't have the same amount of bite, so that while there hasn't been totally successful stockholder activity, there's been enough so that people who are subject to it are beginning to change their ways, because they recognize the interesting thing about the Valdez principles, which have been on a number of ballots, is they've gotten much higher support than is traditional when you've got a citizens group that throws one out. So there has been some stockholder activity. It is having some effect. And in fairness to the maquiladora operators, the bigger guys seem to be working hard at doing it better. The more pressure they're under, the more rapidly they go that route. And they point out, and they're correct, that the working conditions in those plants are better than what people would find elsewhere. The compensation's a little better, but the conditions around them, for which to date they have taken little responsibility, the need for infrastructure, housing, and so on, are horrendous. The question is, what could there be in the way of an ombudsman that could continue to organize public pressure to, in front of the NAFTA commissions or whatever, to make it work? I would suggest to you that those entities do exist. I lead one of them. There are other environmental groups. Some of the local groups are very active. The thing that I think is important to recognize is that these things don't happen by themselves. They require membership support. They require people who are concerned about them. I think at the moment there's no lack of entities to do it. I think the thing that's lacking is the support for those entities to be able to mobilize the staff and others to make it go. And I think the whole question of what the border looks like is one that's going to be receiving a lot of attention. Again, I publish Audubon magazine as well as leading the institution. We're doing a major story on the maquiladoras and what the border looks like in our next issue. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. There's been some very dramatic television coverage of what things look like. And it really is the question of getting all of this into the public debate. How it's going to work with NAFTA, I think, is not clear, because there are plenty who say reasonably this is so horrendous that having more of it is going to make it worse. And the reason that I reject that notion is it is so horrendous that you've got to start doing something about it, and NAFTA is the only thing we've got that begins to do it. But I would suggest that the whole business of citizen ombudsman is out there, and there are numbers around, but they need support. The question was asked, what are you doing to stop the crazies on the fringe of the environmental movement? the eco-taj people, the eco-terrorists, and what have you, and how do we deal with an NBC that has its own agenda and therefore editorializes in the form of news. I think that's basically what you were saying. I'm going to leave the broadcasting industry to Ted Turner and others who have said about it. Let me address the point that you make. What are you doing, i.e. Peter Berle or some other environmental, about people on the fringe?
What is being done? That's
well,
more
let
general.
me suggest what is being done. Part of the American scene and part of our freedoms involve people who are on the fringes of all kinds of things. To argue that there are only loonies on the fringe of the environmental movement is simply not to look at reality. There are people on the fringes of the other side as well. I know that personally.
Why does it have to be sides?
Let me finish.
We're all in this together.
Let me finish. Let me say that there are people on the fringes of everything. I'm quite proud of the fact that I seem to have been the recipient in a land use fight in the Adirondacks of part of a modern technology. It is the death threat by fax. That's new. It's interesting. The use of slap suits to intimidate people. I was sued for $40 million last year. I'm glad I didn't have a college loan pending at that time. Abusive process and people being on the fringe, whether it be on the environmental side, whether it be on any other side, is unfortunately part of our culture. Let me suggest that it is very hard to say these guys are good and these fellows are bad. It's easy on the terrorism side. There is no excuse, and all of us speak out, and I do frequently on the eco-terrorist end. But once you get away from the violence and the threats, which is not acceptable any place, then there are people that have crazy ideas. And we cannot operate in a free society in which we don't encourage that. There was some guy who had a crazy idea that the world was round. There have been lots of crazy ideas. So the real challenge is how we keep this debate robust and how we welcome the opposing views without tolerating the kinds of things that prevent views from being expressed, whether it be terrorism, whether it be threats, and so on. That's a bigger problem than the environmentalists or somebody else. All I can say is that in the environmental side, those of us that run big organizations spend a lot of our time on public television and other places saying that the terrorist piece is not part of us. And the way you make that stick is that they don't get any credence, they don't get any support, and they're dealt with within the confines of a legal system that says when you blow people up or you threaten them, you are subject to sanctions. I don't see any other way of doing that. Then you say, why do there have to be sides? And let me suggest that the question isn't differing points of view and sides. The question is deriving mechanisms by which public policy moves forward while people have divergent views. I mean, we are a society that functions by plaintiffs and defendants, unions and management. We have sort of particularized this view of conflict, and we're also finding that it doesn't work very well in many cases. Increasingly on the management side, you talk about management by teams and all of that, and that's a plus. But also, speaking as a lawyer, there is some value in being able to stake out issues and have opposing views come together and then have a resolution. Now, one of the problems with the law is maybe there's never a resolution. So I think the question is not how you eliminate conflict, but how you make it productive. And that's a challenge. Frank, you told me they were going to turn into pumpkins at 7:10. It's 7:15, and I don't see too many pumpkins out there. I apologize for taking so long.